The sweet scent of roses filled the air as Dr. Eleanor Washington carefully trimmed the bushes that lined her front yard. At 68, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but gardening brought her a peace that few other activities could match. Her 3 grandchildren played nearby, their laughter a melody that made Eleanor's heart swell with joy. "Grandma, look what I found." Little Zoe, only 7 years old, came running with a colorful butterfly perched on her finger. Eleanor smiled, putting down her garden shears. "That's a monarch butterfly, sweetheart. They're special because they travel thousands of miles every year." Zoe's eyes widened. "Like when we visit Uncle Thomas in Florida." "Even farther," Eleanor chuckled, her voice warm and rich from decades of storytelling. It was their Saturday ritual, Eleanor watching her grandchildren while her daughter Tanya attended her art therapy classes. This modest but well-kept house had been Eleanor's home for over 30 years. A sanctuary purchased after her successful career as a civil rights attorney had finally provided the means for a stable life in this predominantly white suburb. 12-year-old Dion was helping his grandmother by watering the plants, while 9-year-old Zoe and 7-year-old Layla hunted for interesting bugs and flowers. The April sun was gentle today, perfect for being outdoors. "I think these tomato plants will be ready soon," Eleanor said, brushing soil from her hands onto her faded jeans. Despite her professional background, she'd always been most comfortable in casual clothes, especially for gardening days. The sound of a car pulling up caught her attention. Eleanor glanced up to see a police cruiser stopping in front of her house. 2 officers, one tall and broad-shouldered with cropped blonde hair, the other shorter with a rigid posture, stepped out and approached her gate. Eleanor stood slowly, her knees protesting after an hour of kneeling in the garden. She offered a friendly smile as the officers opened her gate without asking and stepped onto her property. "Good afternoon, officers. Can I help you with something?" she asked, automatically moving slightly in front of her grandchildren. The taller officer, his nameplate read Officer Garrett, barely acknowledged her greeting. "We received a call about a suspicious person in this yard. The homeowners in this neighborhood have reported concerns." Eleanor's smile faded, but she kept her voice steady. "I am the homeowner. I've lived here for over 30 years. Officer Garrett exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Reynolds. "Ma'am, we've had reports of people casing houses in this area. Do you have any identification on you?" Dion moved closer to his grandmother, water can still in hand. Eleanor patted his shoulder reassuringly. "My ID is inside the house. I wasn't expecting to need it while gardening in my own front yard." She gestured toward her door. "I'd be happy to show you my driver's license if you'd like to wait here while I get it." Officer Reynolds stepped forward. "How do we know that's actually your house?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, but 30 years of legal practice had taught her to keep her composure. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I've been a resident here since 1995. My name is Dr. Eleanor Washington, and my property deed and identification are inside. Perhaps one of you could accompany me to the door while I retrieve them." "This is a pretty expensive neighborhood," Officer Garrett remarked, looking around. "You live here alone?" Eleanor straightened her back, standing to her full height despite the arthritis that had been bothering her lately. "My financial arrangements are not relevant to confirming my identity. I'd like to show you my ID so we can resolve this matter quickly. My grandchildren and I were enjoying our afternoon." Little Layla tugged at Eleanor's gardening apron. "Grandma, did we do something wrong?" Her voice trembled slightly. "No, sweetheart. The officers are just confused." "Everything's going to be fine," Eleanor said, though she felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach, a sensation she'd known too many times before. Officer Reynolds moved closer, his hand resting near his belt. "Ma'am, your attitude is becoming problematic. We need to see some identification now." "I've already explained that my identification is inside the house," Eleanor replied, her patience wearing thin, but her voice remaining calm. "I'm a 68-year-old woman gardening with my grandchildren on a Saturday afternoon. I'm hardly a threat to anyone." The new family across the street had stepped onto their porch watching the scene unfold. Eleanor recognized them. They'd moved in just 2 months ago and hadn't attended any of the neighborhood gatherings yet. "Look," Eleanor said, "I understand someone might have called because they didn't recognize me. That's fine, but now that we're talking, I hope you can see this is a misunderstanding." I'm happy to show you my ID. Officer Garrett looked skeptical. You say you've lived here 30 years, but we've never seen you before. Eleanor couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Are you suggesting you've memorized every homeowner in this entire district? I find that hard to believe. It was the wrong thing to say. Officer Garrett's expression hardened. Ma'am, step away from the children and put your hands where I can see them. Dion moved closer to his grandmother. She didn't do anything wrong. This is her house. Son, step back, Officer Reynolds warned, his hand now resting on his holster. Eleanor felt her heart racing, but years of experience in tense courtrooms had taught her to appear outwardly calm. Officers, this is escalating unnecessarily. These are my grandchildren and you're frightening them. More neighbors had come outside now, drawn by the unusual sight of police in their quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from next door approached her fence. Eleanor, is everything okay? She called. Before Eleanor could answer, Officer Garrett cut in. Ma'am, please stay back. This is police business. Eleanor looked toward her longtime neighbor. Patricia, would you mind calling Tanya for me? Let her know there's been a misunderstanding with some officers. Mrs. Chen nodded and disappeared back into her house. Ma'am, I won't ask again. Step away from the children and keep your hands visible, Officer Garrett demanded, his voice rising. Eleanor slowly raised her hands, soil still embedded under her fingernails. Children, go stand by the roses, please. Everything will be fine. But Grandma, Dion started to protest. Do as I say. Dion, Eleanor said firmly, her eyes never leaving the officers. The children reluctantly moved away, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. Now, officers, I'd like to reach for my phone in my pocket to call my daughter. Or would you prefer to accompany me inside to get my ID? Those are the only two reasonable options here. Officer Reynolds stepped forward. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Eleanor stared in disbelief. You're going to handcuff me? In front of my grandchildren? For gardening in my own yard? You're not complying with our instructions, Officer Garrett said. That's reasonable suspicion for us to detain you until we can verify your identity. Eleanor's mind raced through decades of legal knowledge. She knew her rights, and she knew arguing further could escalate things dangerously, especially with her grandchildren watching. I am complying. I'm simply asking for a reasonable accommodation to retrieve my identification. She kept her voice steady, despite her rising indignation. This is textbook racial profiling, officers. Officer Garrett's face reddened. Turn around now or we'll have to use force. The children began crying as Eleanor slowly turned around, her dignity intact despite the humiliation coursing through her. The cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists, biting into skin that had grown thinner with age. Grandma, Layla screamed, starting to run toward her. Stay back, Layla, Eleanor called out, her voice finally betraying her emotion. Mrs. Chen will watch you until your mother comes. Everything will be okay. Officer Reynolds began reciting her rights while Officer Garrett held her firmly by the arm. The contrast between his grip and her frail arm was not lost on the gathering neighbors, several of whom had pulled out their phones. Officers, those handcuffs are unnecessary and painful, Eleanor said, wincing as they cut into her wrists. I'm a senior citizen with arthritis who was gardening with her grandchildren. Does this really seem appropriate to you? Dion, showing courage beyond his years, had pulled out his own phone and was recording the scene, tears streaming down his face. Put that down, son, Officer Garrett barked. It's his right to record, Eleanor said firmly, and it's my property, my grandchildren, and my constitutional rights you're violating right now. As they led her toward the police car, Eleanor held her head high despite the pain in her wrists and the deeper ache in her heart at her grandchildren witnessing this indignity. But beneath her calm exterior, something was building. A familiar fire that had fueled her through decades of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw an elderly black woman in gardening clothes, deemed her suspicious, and never bothered to look deeper. They didn't see Dr. Eleanor Washington, the civil rights attorney who had faced down far more intimidating opponents than two suburban police officers with authority issues. As they placed her in the back of the police car, Eleanor caught Dion's eye and gave him a small, reassuring nod. The boy stood straighter, continuing to record despite his tears. What these officers didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know as they drove away with her in handcuffs, was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering her strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been profiled, every family traumatized, every community betrayed by those sworn to protect them. And Eleanor Washington had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Though she'd prayed it would never come, the police cruiser pulled away from Eleanor's home, leaving her 3 grandchildren standing in the yard with tears streaming down their faces. 12-year-old Dion held his phone steady, still recording as the car disappeared around the corner. His hands were shaking, but he remembered what his grandmother had taught him about documenting everything. "We need to call Mom right now," he said, his voice cracking as he turned to his younger sisters. Inside the police car, Eleanor sat straight-backed, despite the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The pain in her shoulders was getting worse. Arthritis didn't mix well with having your arms pulled behind your back, but she refused to show any discomfort. Decades of practicing law had taught her that composure was a weapon all its own. "Officers," she said calmly, "I'd like to know exactly what I'm being charged with." Officer Garrett kept his eyes on the road. "Resisting arrest and disorderly conduct." "Interesting," Eleanor replied, her voice measured. "Since I wasn't under arrest when I supposedly resisted, and there was nothing disorderly about asking to retrieve my identification from my own home." Officer Reynolds turned slightly in his seat. "You were uncooperative with police instructions." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I have the right to ask questions about why I'm being detained on my own property. That's not being uncooperative, that's exercising my constitutional rights." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing more. Eleanor used the silence to observe details about them: their car, their badge numbers, all information that would be useful later. The lawyer in her never really turned off. Her thoughts turned to her grandchildren. Patricia Chen would look after them until Tanya arrived, but the image of their frightened faces as she was handcuffed burned in her mind. No child should have to see their grandmother treated like a criminal. She took a deep breath, pushing down the anger that threatened to overwhelm her composure. The drive to the station was short. Officer Garrett parked and came around to open the door. "Can you stand up, ma'am?" he asked, his tone notably more professional now that they were at the station where other officers and possibly cameras would be watching. "Yes, though it's difficult with my hands restrained," Eleanor replied. "I'm requesting that these handcuffs be removed. They're causing me pain due to my arthritis." Officer Reynolds hesitated, then nodded to his partner. The handcuffs were removed and Eleanor rubbed her wrists, noting the red marks they had left. Evidence, she thought to herself. The station was busy, officers moving back and forth between desks, phones ringing, the usual controlled chaos of law enforcement at work. A few officers looked up as Eleanor was led in, their expressions curious. It wasn't every day they saw a well-dressed elderly woman being brought in. At the booking desk, a sergeant looked up from his computer. "What have we got here?" "Resisting arrest and disorderly conduct," Officer Garrett said, but Eleanor noticed his voice lacked conviction. "I'd like to make my phone call, please," Eleanor said to the sergeant. "And I want to file a formal complaint against these officers for racial profiling, false arrest, and use of excessive force given my age and physical condition." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked at the officers, then back at Eleanor. "Let's get your booking done first, ma'am." Eleanor stood patiently as her fingerprints were taken, her photograph snapped for a mugshot. The indignity of it all might have broken someone else, but Eleanor had spent a lifetime fighting against exactly this kind of injustice. She'd represented countless clients who had been wrongfully arrested, but experiencing it firsthand kindled a new fire within her. "Name?" the booking officer asked. "Dr. Eleanor Washington," she replied, emphasizing her title. The officer paused, fingers hovering over his keyboard. "Occupation?" "Retired civil rights attorney. Former partner at Washington, Garcia and Klein." At this, Officer Garrett shifted uncomfortably. The booking officer's eyes widened slightly. "Address?" he continued, his tone noticeably more respectful. Eleanor gave her address, the same house she'd been gardening in front of when they arrested her. After booking was complete, Eleanor was led to a phone on the wall. She dialed her daughter's number from memory, praying Tanya had already been reached by Mrs. Chen. "Mom," Tanya's voice was frantic. "Where are you?" "The kids called me," "I've been arrested," Eleanor said calmly. "I'm at the Central Precinct. The officers claimed I was resisting arrest and being disorderly, but all I was doing was gardening in our front yard." "What?" Tanya's voice rose. "This is insane. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart, but I need you to call Thomas." Thomas was Eleanor's former colleague, now one of the most respected defense attorneys in the state. "And check on the children. Dion was recording everything. I'm with them now. They're upset, but okay. Dion sent me the video. Mom, it's outrageous what they did to you. Make sure that video is saved in multiple places," Eleanor instructed. "And tell the children I'm fine. I'll be home soon." She hoped that was true. After the call, Eleanor was led to a holding cell. It was clean enough but cold, with a hard bench along one wall. Another woman sat in the corner looking up briefly as Eleanor entered. "What are you in for, Grandma?" the woman asked, her tone not unkind. Eleanor sat down carefully. "Gardening while black, apparently," the woman snorted. "Yeah, that'll do it around here." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Eleanor closed her eyes, mentally reviewing legal precedents that would apply to her case. The cell door opened and a different officer appeared. "Washington, your lawyer's here." Eleanor stood, surprised by how quickly Thomas had arrived. But it wasn't Thomas waiting for her in the interview room. It was her nephew William, his face tight with anger, barely controlled. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, embracing her. "Are you hurt?" "Just my pride and my wrists," she replied. "How did you get here so fast?" "Tanya called me first since I was already downtown. Thomas is on his way with a whole team. William was a junior partner at a different law firm. The video is already circulating online. People are outraged," Eleanor nodded. She had expected as much. Dion was savvy with social media, and injustice caught on camera tended to spread quickly. "Have they told you what evidence they have for these ridiculous charges?" William asked, opening his briefcase. "None, because there is none," Eleanor replied. "I was gardening with my grandchildren when officers approached, claimed someone reported a suspicious person, and demanded identification. When I explained my ID was inside my house and offered to get it, they refused to let me and escalated the situation." William took notes, his pen pressing hard against the paper. They had no warrant, no probable cause, nothing but a vague call about a suspicious person, which I'm guessing came from that new family that moved in across from you. Eleanor shrugged. "Possibly. I haven't met them properly yet." The door opened again and a middle-aged man in a suit entered. "Dr. Washington? I'm Lieutenant Harding. I'd like to speak with you about what happened today." William straightened. "My client won't be answering questions without proper legal representation present." "I'm family, not her attorney of record." The lieutenant nodded. "Actually, I'm here to inform Dr. Washington that the charges are being reviewed. We've received multiple calls from witnesses, and there's video evidence suggesting the arresting officers may have acted hastily." Eleanor met his gaze. "Hastily? Is that what we're calling racial profiling now?" Lieutenant Harding had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We're investigating the officer's conduct. In the meantime, you're free to go home while we review the situation." "So no charges?" William pressed. "Not at this time," the lieutenant hedged. "We'll be in touch if that changes." Eleanor stood. "It won't change, Lieutenant, because I've done nothing wrong. And this isn't over, not by a long shot." As they walked through the station toward the exit, Eleanor noticed officers watching her, some whispering to each other. Word had clearly spread about who she was. Good, she thought. Let them know they picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. Thomas was getting out of his car, accompanied by two younger attorneys Eleanor recognized from his firm. When he saw her, relief washed over his face. "Eleanor," he said, hurrying over. "Are you all right?" "I am," she assured him. "And apparently I'm free to go for now." Thomas's expression hardened. "For now, they have absolutely nothing to charge you with. This was textbook racial profiling." "I know," Eleanor said, "and we're going to make sure everyone else knows it too." As they walked to Thomas's car, Eleanor's phone, returned to her along with her other possessions, buzzed repeatedly with incoming messages and calls. She glanced at it and saw notifications from friends, former colleagues, and even a few journalists. "The video's gone viral," William explained, showing her his own phone. "Dion's post has been shared thousands of times already. People are calling for those officers to be fired." Eleanor took a deep breath. She hadn't wanted this kind of attention, had never sought to be the face of yet another example of police misconduct. But now that it had happened, she would use it. Use it to push for the changes she'd been fighting for her entire career. "Take me home," she said quietly. "I need to see my grandchildren. Then we can talk about what comes next." Because there would be a next. This wasn't just about one afternoon, one mistake, two officers who saw an elderly black woman and assumed the worst. This was about a system that needed changing. And Eleanor Washington had just been handed a powerful platform from which to demand that change. As Thomas's car pulled away from the station, Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She was tired. Her wrists still ached, and the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of her grandchildren still stung. But underneath it all was a familiar determination, the same fire that had carried her through decades of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. The officers who arrested her had no idea what they'd set in motion, but they were about to find out. The front door of Eleanor's house swung open before Thomas's car had fully stopped in the driveway. Tanya rushed out, followed closely by the three children. Eleanor barely had time to step out of the car before they surrounded her. Layla and Zoe wrapping their arms around her waist while Dion stood slightly back, trying to look strong despite the redness around his eyes. "Grandma," Layla sobbed. "We were so scared." Eleanor bent down, ignoring the ache in her back, and gathered her grandchildren close. "I know, sweethearts. I was scared too. But I'm home now and I'm okay." Tanya embraced her mother, her eyes full of a mixture of relief and rage. "This should never have happened, never. But it did," Eleanor said quietly. "And now we have to decide what we're going to do about it." Inside, the house was filled with people. Mrs. Chen from next door had brought over a pot of soup. William's wife Vanessa was arranging food on the dining table. Eleanor's friend Grace, who had rushed over after seeing the video online, was brewing tea in the kitchen. The community had rallied quickly. "You should sit down, Mom," Tanya urged, leading Eleanor to her favorite armchair. "You've been through a lot today." Eleanor sank into the chair gratefully but waved off further fussing. "I'm fine, really. What I need now is information." She turned to Thomas, who had followed them inside. "What's happening out there?" Thomas pulled out his phone. "The video has over 100,000 views already. Local news has picked it up, and I've had calls from 3 national outlets. People are outraged." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "And the police department?" "They issued a brief statement saying they're reviewing the incident and will take appropriate action if procedures weren't followed. Standard damage control." Thomas's tone made it clear what he thought of the statement. Dion sat on the arm of his grandmother's chair. "My video has been shared everywhere, Grandma. People are calling those cops all kinds of names." Eleanor patted his hand. "You did exactly the right thing by recording, Dion. That video is our strongest piece of evidence." "Evidence for what?" Tanya asked, though she already knew the answer. "For the complaint we're going to file," Eleanor replied firmly. "For the lawsuit that will follow. And for the changes we're going to demand." The room fell quiet. Everyone there knew Eleanor well enough to recognize the tone in her voice. The one that had made opposing attorneys nervous for decades. The one that said she had found a cause worth fighting for. "I've already called Judge Rivera," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "She wants to meet with you tomorrow." Eleanor smiled slightly. Judge Constance Rivera had been her law clerk 30 years ago, a bright young woman Eleanor had mentored through her early career. Now she sat on the federal bench, known for her strict interpretation of civil rights law. "Good, and I need to speak with Michael at the Urban Justice Center." Michael Wong had been Eleanor's last hire before she retired, now running the nonprofit legal organization she had helped found. William nodded. "Already done. He's assembling a team as we speak." Eleanor looked around the room at the network of support that had materialized so quickly. These were just the people who could be here in person. Her larger network extended much further, through courthouses, law schools, civil rights organizations, and government offices across the state and beyond. Those officers had no idea who they were messing with, did they? Grace said with a small smile, handing Eleanor a cup of tea. "No," Eleanor replied, taking the cup. "They saw an old black woman and made assumptions. They never bothered to look deeper." The doorbell rang and Vanessa went to answer it. She returned moments later with a tall man in a crisp suit. "Dr. Washington," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Jeffrey Barnes from the mayor's office." The mayor would like to express her deep concern about what happened today and hopes you're doing well. Eleanor regarded him coolly. The mayor can express her concern by making sure those officers are properly disciplined and by implementing real changes in police training and accountability. Barnes nodded uncomfortably. She would like to meet with you, at your convenience, of course, to discuss how to move forward. I'll have my assistant call to schedule something, Eleanor replied, though she hadn't had an assistant since retiring. The message was clear. This would be a formal meeting, not a casual chat to smooth things over. After Barnes left, promising to relay her message, Tanya turned to her mother. You're really going to take this all the way, aren't you? Of course I am, Eleanor said. Not just for me, but for everyone who doesn't have a judge on speed dial or a team of lawyers ready to help. What happened today happens to people all across this country every day, and most of them don't have the resources to fight back. At the station, Officer Garrett stared at his computer screen in disbelief. He had been researching the woman they'd arrested earlier, and what he found made his stomach sink. Reynolds, he called to his partner. You need to see this. Officer Reynolds leaned over his shoulder, scanning the screen. Washington, Garcia, and Klein. Isn't that the firm that won that huge civil rights case against the department in Baltimore? Garrett nodded grimly. And guess who led the legal team? Dr. Eleanor Washington. She's won 7 Supreme Court cases on police misconduct and civil rights violations. She literally wrote the textbook they use in law schools on this stuff. Reynolds paled visibly. We arrested her for gardening in her own yard. It gets worse, Garrett continued, scrolling down. She's on the board of the Urban Justice Center. She founded the Civil Liberties Institute. She was special counsel to the governor's task force on police reform 10 years ago. How did we not know this? Reynolds muttered. Because we didn't bother to find out, Garrett replied, a note of resignation in his voice. We saw what we expected to see. Their sergeant approached, his expression grim. Chief wants to see both of you. Now. Across town in the downtown offices of the Urban Justice Center, Michael Wong was addressing a room full of attorneys. On the wall behind him was a projection of Dion's video, paused on the image of Eleanor being led to the police car in handcuffs. Dr. Washington has been our mentor. Our founder and our guiding light, Michael said. Today she became our client, and we will bring every resource we have to bear on this case. A young attorney raised her hand. I've been getting calls from other victims of these same officers. 3 similar incidents in the past year alone. Michael nodded. Document everything. We're building not just an individual case, but a pattern and practice complaint. His phone buzzed with a text from Judge Rivera. Meeting set with Chief Johnson tomorrow. Eleanor should be there. Meanwhile, at Eleanor's house, the family had gathered in the living room. The children had finally calmed down enough to eat dinner, though they stayed close to their grandmother as if afraid she might disappear again. Will those police officers go to jail, Grandma? Zoe asked between bites of pasta. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. Probably not, sweetheart. But they will face consequences for their actions, and more importantly, we're going to try to make sure this doesn't happen to other people. Because of your special powers? Layla asked innocently. The adults in the room exchanged amused glances. What special powers are those? Eleanor asked, smiling. Mom says you have the power to change laws and make bad people sorry, Layla explained. She says you're not just our grandma, you're a legend. Tanya looked slightly embarrassed. I might have built you up a bit when explaining your career to them. Eleanor laughed, the first real laugh since the ordeal began. Well, I don't know about being a legend, but I do know how the system works. And sometimes knowing how things work is its own kind of power. Later that night, after the children were asleep and most of the visitors had gone home, Eleanor sat in her study, surrounded by case files Thomas had brought over. Her wrists still showed faint marks from the handcuffs, a reminder of the day's humiliation. Her phone rang, the special ringtone she'd assigned to her old friend Judge Rivera. Constance, she answered. Thank you for moving so quickly on this. Are you kidding? When I saw that video, I nearly drove over there myself to give those officers a piece of my mind. How are you really, Eleanor? Angry, Eleanor admitted, but focused. This isn't just about me. I know, the judge replied. That's why we need you to lead this fight. There are a dozen other cases just like yours that never get this kind of attention. Eleanor looked at the wall of her study, where photographs chronicled her long career, shaking hands with Supreme Court justices, standing on the steps of the Capitol after landmark victories, receiving awards from presidents. I spent my career fighting these battles in courtrooms, she said. I never expected to become the face of one. Sometimes we don't choose our most important cases, Constance replied. Sometimes they choose us. As she hung up, Eleanor realized the truth in those words. She had been presented with one final case, perhaps her most important one yet, and she would use every connection, every skill, every ounce of knowledge gained over her long career to make it count. Those officers had arrested Eleanor Washington, unaware of her power, but they, and their entire department, were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the city's corridors of power. Eleanor woke early, her body stiff from yesterday's ordeal but her mind sharp and focused. She dressed with particular care, a tailored navy suit she'd worn for her last Supreme Court appearance before retirement, pearl earrings that had been her mother's, sensible but expensive shoes. Armor of a sort. In the kitchen she found Tanya already up, making coffee and checking her phone. The local morning news played quietly on the small TV on the counter. "You're on every channel," Tanya said, sliding a cup of coffee toward her mother. "They're calling it gardening while black now." Eleanor sipped her coffee, watching as her own face appeared on the screen. Not her mugshot, thankfully, but a photo from a law school commencement, where she'd been the keynote speaker last year. The headline below read, "Distinguished civil rights attorney arrested in her own front yard." "The grandchildren still asleep?" Eleanor asked. Tanya nodded. "Finally." Dion kept getting up to check his phone. "The video has over 1 million views now." Eleanor shook her head, still struggling to wrap her mind around how quickly everything had spread. "Is he okay? Are all of them okay?" "They're shaken up," Tanya admitted. "But also proud of you in a way. Especially Dion. He keeps saying his grandma is going to make those cops pay." Eleanor frowned slightly. "I need to talk with him about that. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability and change." The doorbell rang and Tanya went to answer it. She returned with Thomas and Michael Wong, both dressed in business attire. "The car's ready whenever you are," Thomas said. "The meeting at the police department is at 9, then the mayor at 11, and Judge Rivera has scheduled chambers for 2 o'clock. Eleanor nodded, finishing her coffee. "And the press?" Michael stepped forward. "We've prepared a statement but recommended declining interviews for now. Better to let the legal process begin before making detailed public comments." "Good," Eleanor agreed. "Though I want to make one thing clear to everyone. I won't accept any settlement that doesn't include structural changes to the department. No confidentiality agreements, no quiet payouts." The 3 younger attorneys exchanged glances. They'd expected nothing less. The police headquarters was an imposing building of glass and concrete downtown. As Thomas's car approached, they could see a small crowd of protesters on the sidewalk, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Dr. Washington" and "Black Lives Matter." News vans lined the street. "Word travels fast," Eleanor murmured. "Social media," Michael replied. "We didn't organize this, it's spontaneous." They were led through a side entrance to avoid the cameras and escorted to a conference room on the top floor. Inside waited Police Chief Johnson, a stern-looking woman with short gray hair, the city attorney David Chen, and to Eleanor's surprise, Mayor Lewis herself. "Dr. Washington," the chief said, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming. First, let me express my sincere apologies for what occurred yesterday." Eleanor remained standing, her expression composed. "I appreciate that, Chief Johnson. But I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to discuss concrete actions." Mayor Lewis gestured to the chairs. "Please, let's all sit down and talk this through. We want to resolve this situation in a way that addresses your concerns, Dr. Washington." Eleanor took a seat, placing her briefcase on the table. Thomas sat beside her with Michael on her other side. The positioning wasn't accidental. They formed a united front. "Let's start with Officers Garrett and Reynolds," Eleanor said. "What disciplinary actions are being taken?" Chief Johnson cleared her throat. "They've been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Their body camera footage is being reviewed, along with the video your grandson recorded. And if the investigation confirms what we all already know," Eleanor pressed, "there will be appropriate consequences," the chief replied carefully. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Chief Johnson, let me be clear. Those officers handcuffed me in front of my grandchildren for gardening in my own yard. They humiliated me, caused me physical pain, and traumatized 3 children. Appropriate consequences needs to mean termination at minimum. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Washington, while we understand your frustration, this isn't frustration, Mr. Chen, Eleanor interrupted. This is righteous anger. And more importantly, it's a clear-cut case of racial profiling, false arrest, and excessive use of force. She opened her briefcase and removed a folder, sliding it across the table. This contains documentation of 7 similar incidents involving these same officers over the past 2 years. All involving people of color, all involving questionable probable cause. Chief Johnson's eyes widened slightly as she glanced at the folder's contents. Where did you get this information? I have connections throughout this community, Eleanor replied simply. People who have been waiting for someone with the resources and platform to expose these patterns. Mayor Lewis interjected. What exactly are you seeking here, Dr. Washington? Eleanor had come prepared for this question. First, the immediate termination of Officers Garrett and Reynolds. Second, a comprehensive review of all arrests and stops made by these officers during their tenure. Third, mandatory retraining on racial bias for the entire department. Fourth, the implementation of a citizen review board with actual teeth, including subpoena power and disciplinary authority. The room fell silent as the officials exchanged glances. That's extensive, the city attorney finally said. It's necessary, Eleanor countered, and it's just the beginning. My team is prepared to file a federal civil rights lawsuit by the end of the week if we don't see immediate action. Outside the police headquarters, the crowd of protesters had grown. Among them was Dion, who had convinced his mother to bring him downtown instead of going to school. He held a sign that read, "Respect our elders," and chanted along with the crowd. A young reporter approached him. You're Dr. Washington's grandson, right? The one who recorded the video? Dion nodded cautiously, remembering his grandmother's warnings about talking to the press. How does it feel to have your video go viral? The reporter pressed. Dion thought for a moment. It doesn't feel good. Nothing about this feels good. My grandma was just gardening. She shouldn't have to be a hashtag or a trending video to be treated with respect. Inside, the meeting continued. Chief Johnson had called in her deputy to discuss the feasibility of Eleanor's demands. A citizen review board would require city council approval, the deputy explained. Then get it, Eleanor replied. I've already spoken with Councilwoman Harris and Councilman Rodriguez. They're prepared to introduce the legislation next week. Mayor Lewis looked surprised. You've been busy in the last 24 hours? No, Eleanor corrected her. I've been building relationships and fighting for these changes for 40 years. Yesterday just gave me a new platform from which to demand them. By the time they left police headquarters 2 hours later, they had a tentative agreement. The officers would remain on leave until the investigation was complete. The department would implement immediate retraining. The mayor would support the creation of a citizen review board. It wasn't everything Eleanor wanted, but it was a start. Outside, the crowd cheered as she emerged. Eleanor paused, surprised by the response. She saw Dion among the protesters and beckoned him over. You should be in school, young man, she said, though there was no real sternness in her voice. This is more important, Dion replied. Did they fire those cops? Not yet, Eleanor told him honestly. But we've started something important here. Change takes time. A reporter pushed forward. Dr. Washington, will you be filing a lawsuit? Eleanor looked directly into the camera. This isn't about money. It's about justice and accountability. If that requires legal action, then yes, we're prepared to go that route. But what I really want is for no other grandmother to be handcuffed in front of her grandchildren for the crime of existing in her own front yard. The crowd erupted in applause. Later that afternoon, in Judge Rivera's chambers, Eleanor sat with her legal team reviewing their strategy. The department's internal investigation will be a whitewash, Judge Rivera warned. You know that, Eleanor. Of course, Eleanor agreed. That's why we're filing in federal court, and why we need the media attention to continue. Thomas looked up from his notes. Speaking of media, Dion's video was picked up by national news this morning. You're trending on every platform. Eleanor shook her head slightly. I never thought I'd become the face of a movement at 68 years old. You've always been the face of the movement, Michael pointed out. The difference is now people are paying attention. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor spotted Officers Garrett and Reynolds standing near the entrance, accompanied by their union representative. They looked uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. Eleanor paused, then made a decision. She walked directly toward them. The officers stiffened, clearly unsure what to expect. "Officers," she said, her voice level, "I want you to know something. This isn't personal. What happened yesterday is part of a systemic problem, and you are merely symptoms of that problem. But make no mistake, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that both you and the system face appropriate consequences." Officer Garrett swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we were just following—" "Don't," Eleanor cut him off. "Don't say you were following protocol. If your protocol led you to handcuff a grandmother for gardening in her own yard, then your protocol is broken, and we're going to fix it." She turned and walked away, her head high, her steps steady. Behind her, through the glass doors of the courthouse, she could see Dion watching, a look of pride on his young face. Eleanor smiled to herself. This was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 months had passed since that spring afternoon when Eleanor was handcuffed in her front yard. Summer had bloomed fully now, and Eleanor sat in the same garden, tending to her roses that had flourished despite the chaos that followed that day. So much had changed, yet here she was, back where it all began. "Grandma, they're here," Dion called from the porch, waving his phone excitedly. Eleanor stood up slowly, brushing soil from her hands. Her knees protested a bit more these days, but she ignored the discomfort. She'd long ago learned that some pain was worth enduring for the right cause. A news van had pulled up outside her house, along with several cars. From one emerged Mayor Lewis, looking considerably more humble than she had during their first meeting. From another came Michael and Thomas, carrying folders and wearing expressions of quiet triumph. Chief Johnson, former Chief Johnson now, was noticeably absent, having resigned 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrest when an independent investigation revealed a pattern of overlooked complaints against several officers, including Garrett and Reynolds. "Dr. Washington," the mayor greeted her, extending a hand. "Today's a big day." Eleanor nodded, accepting the handshake. "A necessary day, Mayor Lewis." They gathered in Eleanor's living room, where a small podium had been set up for the press conference. Cameras were positioned, microphones checked. Eleanor sat with her family, Tanya, Dion, Zoe, and little Layla, on one side, the officials and her legal team on the other. Mayor Lewis stepped up to the microphones first. 3 months ago, an inexcusable incident occurred in our city. Dr. Eleanor Washington, a respected attorney and community leader, was wrongfully arrested while gardening in her own yard. Today, I'm here to announce the formal implementation of the Washington Accord. Eleanor listened as the mayor outlined the changes that would be implemented throughout the police department and city government, changes that bore her name but represented the work of countless individuals who had fought for decades for police accountability. The Citizen Review Board is now fully established with oversight and disciplinary powers, the mayor continued. Retraining on racial bias and de-escalation has been completed for all officers. And most importantly, Officers Garrett and Reynolds have been terminated from the force following the completion of the internal investigation. There was no joy in Eleanor's heart at those words, only a sense of rightness, of justice served. This had never been about punishing 2 officers. It had been about changing a system. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she rose slowly and approached the podium. The cameras focused on her, but she had long ago overcome any nervousness about public speaking. 3 months ago, I was handcuffed and humiliated for the crime of gardening while black, she began, her voice clear and strong. Today we see the beginning, and I stress only the beginning, of real change. But this isn't just about policy papers and press conferences. This is about human dignity. This is about ensuring that no grandmother has to explain to her grandchildren why someone with a badge can treat her like a criminal for simply existing in her own space. She paused, looking directly into the main camera. To those watching who have experienced similar injustices but didn't have a viral video or a legal background or powerful connections, I see you. This victory is yours too. And to those in power who think that occasional reforms will solve the problem, understand that we are no longer asking. We are demanding the basic respect and dignity that every human being deserves. After the press conference, as the officials left and the news vans packed up their equipment, Eleanor sat on her porch swing with her grandchildren. Dion had grown an inch taller in the past 3 months, his voice occasionally cracking as adolescence took hold. He'd become something of a young activist, starting a social justice club at his middle school. "Are you happy, Grandma?" Zoe asked, leaning against Eleanor's side. "Did the bad police officers learn their lesson?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "I'm satisfied that some good has come from what happened. But it's not about teaching anyone a lesson, sweetheart. It's about making things better for everyone." "The new police chief is coming to my school next week," Dion mentioned. "She's doing this listening tour thing, talking to kids about how they feel about police officers." Eleanor nodded approvingly. Chief Patricia Rivera, no relation to the judge but equally committed to reform, had been appointed after Johnson's resignation. She was implementing changes that went beyond what the Washington Accord had required, including community outreach programs and hiring practices designed to build a more diverse department. "Will you come speak at my club, Grandma?" Dion asked. "Tell everyone about what happened and what you did about it?" "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "But I want to talk about more than just what happened to me. I want to talk about all the people who've been fighting this fight for generations." Later that evening, after the grandchildren had gone home with Tanya, Eleanor sat alone in her study. On her desk lay a letter, an invitation to speak at the police academy's graduation ceremony. Next to it was an offer from a major publisher for a book about her experience and the changes it had sparked. Her phone rang. Judge Rivera, calling for their weekly check-in. "I saw the press conference," the judge said after they'd exchanged greetings. "You were magnificent, as always." "How are you feeling?" Eleanor sighed, allowing herself a moment of candor with her old friend. "Tired, Constance. Proud of what we've accomplished, but tired, and a little sad that it took something like this to make people listen." "I know," the judge replied softly, "but you've turned a traumatic experience into something powerful. That takes extraordinary strength." After they hung up, Eleanor walked through her quiet house to the front window. Outside, her garden flourished in the summer evening light. The roses she'd been tending when the police arrived that day were in full bloom now, their fragrance drifting through the open window. She thought about Garrett and Reynolds. Last she'd heard, Reynolds had enrolled in community college courses on social work, seemingly genuine in his desire to understand where he'd gone wrong. Garrett had moved to another state. She felt no animosity toward them now, only hope that they had learned something valuable from the experience. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Eleanor opened the door to find Mrs. Chen from next door, holding a small potted plant. "I saw everyone here earlier," her neighbor said. "Thought you might want some company now that the circus has left town." Eleanor smiled, welcoming her in. "Perfect timing. I was just about to make some tea." As they sat in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen placed the pot on the table. "It's a peace lily. Thought it might look nice in your garden." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said. "I'll plant it tomorrow." "You know," Mrs. Chen said, "my grandson asked me the other day if you were famous. He saw you on TV and couldn't believe his friend's grandmother knew you." Eleanor laughed. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him you were something better than famous. You're important." The next morning, Eleanor woke early. She made herself a cup of coffee and went out to the front yard while the dew still clung to the grass. The peace lily from Mrs. Chen sat on the porch waiting to be planted. Eleanor knelt in the soil, feeling the earth between her fingers as she dug a small hole. As she worked, a police car drove slowly down the street on morning patrol. The officer inside, a young woman Eleanor didn't recognize, nodded respectfully as she passed. Eleanor nodded back, then returned to her gardening. The sun was rising higher now, promising another beautiful day. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of her neighborhood waking up. Children's voices, cars starting, the rhythm of everyday life continuing. She placed the peace lily in the hole she'd dug, patting the soil around it gently. Growth took time, she knew. Change didn't happen overnight, but with proper care and attention, even the most delicate things could flourish. As she worked, Eleanor thought about the book she might write, the speeches she would give, the classes of police cadets she would address. There was still so much work to be done, but for this moment, in this garden where it all began, she allowed herself to simply be, not Dr. Washington, the civil rights icon, not the face of a movement, just Eleanor, a grandmother with soil under her fingernails and hope in her heart. The peace lily would bloom in its own time, and so would the seeds of change she had planted.